thank you for being here today in such a boring topic. I mean, including foresight and anticipatory thinking in governments. Yes, we'll try to answer the question, how should governments act on foresight? And it's not an easy question, you can imagine. So we have three amazing friends here to try to investigate this. I'm Epaminondas Christofilopoulos. I'm the biggest name in the conference because my name has 30 letters. And I'm the UNESCO Chair on Futures Research, but I was also serving in the Prime Minister's office for 2 years, trying to include anticipatory policy making. I was not successful. I hope I'll be more successful today asking questions to you, and you might be more able to say something useful today. So let me briefly introduce to my colleagues. On my left, it's Dimitri Lorenzani. Dimitri is an economist. He's a visiting professor at the College of Europe in Greece, and he's currently the cabinet member at Maros Sefcovic, the European Commission's executive vice president, who is responsible for the European Green Deal, the interinstitutional relations, and of course, foresight. And then we have Arti Krishnan. Arti is an international geopolitical intelligence, risk anticipation, and foresight expert. She has been recently working with the UN system and governments globally to institutionalize risk anticipation systems. Thank you. And at the corner, we have Cheryl Chang. She has an impressive track record, more than 18 years working on strategic foresight as a practitioner in Singapore. With really high-level decision makers. She has been also the head of Kantar Public, which is a private business, a world-leading business focusing on the public realm. So I'm really happy that we have you today, and I hope you're gonna share your wisdom for this really boring but also interesting topic. Okay, so the first question is going to Arti. So you're going to have only 3 minutes, 4 minutes for every question. Please be on time. And so we're going to have time to take some more questions from the audience. So, Arti, your work is focused on building anticipatory systems within multilaterals and government. So why is there a need to be anticipatory, particularly in the space of risk and governance?
Thank you. So it is boring, but also incredibly important. Most governance systems, whether in the multilateral system or within governments themselves, are not set up to understanding or being able to act on emerging risk. Usually, internal risk management practices, policies, frameworks are based on analyzing data based on what has happened in the past to date, and then projecting out what it might look like. But what happens with that is we tend to look at risk in silos. We're still talking about climate as if it's one issue, technology as if it's another issue, violence or gender or whatever it is, geopolitical alliances, etc., as one issue. The challenge for us in this time of uncertainty is that risks are not siloed issues. They are interconnected, they are intersected, and they are occurring very, very, very quickly. So I want to give a short example of what I mean by this. In Pakistan in early 2022, the country started out already on a financial backstep. They were on the verge of default. Now, then what happened? The war in Ukraine broke out, and supply chain prices blew up all over the world, right? Cost of living went up, cost of coal, cost of oil, cost of energy, everything went up. And for many developing and emerging economies, it made the very ability to turn your heat on or turn the stove on impossible. So in Pakistan, that started off already verging on default, on debt default. The cost of living crisis pushed it incredibly out of the radar for them. Then in summer 2022, Pakistan also, as many states around the world, experienced an incredibly hot summer. So there were parts of Pakistan that were experiencing heat above 50 degrees Celsius. So if you imagine a population that predominantly works outside, that they cannot afford to turn AC on or the fan on, and it would make life uninhabitable. In the middle of all of that, the typhoon happened, the hurricane happened, and I think it was up to 30, please don't quote me on this, but millions of people got displaced. At the end of that, the Prime Minister Imran Khan got ousted, and it set off a trigger of multiple political crises. This isn't a one-off. This is happening in all our countries, all over the world, and we need to better understand how these issues interact with each other and put in policy and investment mechanisms that can help mitigate against this continued emergence of convoluted risk and understanding what it means for us in terms of the social contract policies, investment policies we need to have in place to keep our citizens safe.
Thank you, and thank you for being on time as well. Yes, this is my role today. Okay, that's amazing, and I like also your example. And coming back to Europe now, and working in the Prime Minister's office for this, I was always finding a lot of obstacles. Some of them were really obstacles. Some of them, to my eyes, that I was not coming from the policy field, looked just silly. I mean, you are in the cabinet and you are overlooking what is happening in all the European countries. So I would like to hear from you, I mean, how we can overcome this resistance that governments have to change, and how we can encourage this shift towards anticipatory governance, and also how Foresight has helped so far the EU to develop.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming to this session, and thank you, Nonda, for the question. It's a very important one because when we talk about strategic foresight, we mean exactly this. We are not looking into the future, we're not looking into long-term trends for the sake of it, or as a purely scientific or theoretical exercise, but with a very specific goal to influence policy making. And this is actually what you mentioned in your question as a shifting towards anticipatory governance. Now, this is exactly the vision that European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen had back in 2019 when she decided to make strategic foresight a political portfolio and to create, for the very first time, the college member in charge of strategic foresight, Executive Vice President Maros Šefčovič, with a very specific mandate, embedding foresight into policymaking. So what I want to say is that strategic foresight should indeed be part of the solution in order to overcome what you correctly highlighted as widespread and I would say quite natural resistance to change, inertia, path dependence. And I can give two concrete examples of how strategic foresight has been helping in the context of the European Union. The first example is, of course, our strategic foresight reports. This is a communication that is adopted every year by the College of Commissioners, and by design, it includes 10 concrete recommendations, 10 areas for action that are meant to influence the European Commission's line to take, political narrative, beyond well-known, well-replayed lines to take. Seems very easy, but I can tell you that it is the result of a very complex exercise of collective intelligence inside the Commission through our so-called strategic foresight network of cabinets and services, one of which I have the pleasure to chair, as well as across EU institutions through ESPAS, our interinstitutional foresight network. The goal is to move to what I like to call foresight optimism. It basically means being honest, truthful about inconvenient truths, but not with the goal of drowning into pessimism and inaction, but in order to be able to think out of the box how to solve these challenges, how to address these inconvenient truths. It's something we're working on. The second example, to close, since you're here, Nonda, is the creation of the EU-wide Foresight Network of Ministers for the Future. Back in 2020, we asked 27 governments to indicate a person, a foresight ambassador in charge of foresight at ministerial level. And we make sure that these Ministers for the Future convene at least once a year in order to discuss about long-term trends that have an impact on policy making. We are starting to see the fruits of this work as more and more member states are creating foresight cells directly attached to prime ministers. Of course, classic example, Finland, but many more are coming. Spain, we see Lithuania, we see Luxembourg, we see Greece, and many other rising stars. And Epaminondas knows very well about all this. And just one last word to say, of course, that foresight is part of the solution not only in Europe, in my view, but also beyond Europe. And we have been working a lot with third countries from which we have a lot to learn. And I'm looking towards Cheryl because Singapore is a very good example, but also Dubai. We had Her Excellency Al Rumi opening our annual ESPAS conference back in 2021. So I want to say also that we need to do this in a collective manner, and working with third countries is also extremely important. Thank you.
Thank you, Dimitri. And actually, that was, you are connecting very much with what I would like to ask Cheryl, because, I mean, usually, I mean, we know Foresight, in Foresight, one size doesn't fit all, and we need to really design something that is relevant to a specific culture, a specific need. And okay, I will not make any comment about what is happening in Europe, but I will come to Cheryl, and because you have a lot of experience, you are coming from another area of the world, and this kind of forum here in Dubai give us this opportunity exactly to have the views from all over the world. So tell us, I mean, how does anticipatory governance vary across different countries and cultural contexts, and what local governments actually can learn from global best practices in anticipatory governance?
Great. Yeah, thanks so much for the question. Hi, everyone. So I think, let me put on my Foresight practitioner hat, and I work very much in the public policy space. In many cases, for those of us who spend a lot of time horizon scanning, we are actually looking at very similar trends, actually. And when we, across continents and, across our work, compare notes, there's actually a lot of similarity. But I think one thing to reflect on is that actually when we are thinking about our unit of analysis, when we're trying to translate from foresight into strategy, that unit of analysis is very important because that is actually very local. So while the trends can be a very global scan, when you pull it down to what does it mean for my organization, my business, my country, then it gets quite specific. So I think the understanding your own system well and that context in which you operate, really cannot be understated. And I think for me, especially having moved from a in-house foresight practitioner to the consulting space, I think that's also a distinction that has kind of emerged. So maybe let me give you a couple of examples as well. So I wear many hats. One of those hats is as an educator. So I teach public policy at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. And so I actually taught a class last week with our colleagues from Demos Helsinki. So the Finland model as well as the Singapore model, of course, are compared quite often. And the class was about anticipatory policy innovation and decision making. So in Finland, you think about why a foresight unit in a prime minister's office might exist, and in many cases, the goal is very much around strategic alignment. They have a slightly different political system from Singapore, so it's also a way of getting alignment across different parties in a coalition government, so we have a base of working together over the next term. But in Singapore, it's a bit more of a single-party dominant system, where the function is a very strongly bureaucratic function, and I do hope you have the chance to meet some of my colleagues from Singapore who are in some of these roles. But what is similar, so this is the academic side of me, right? What is similar is that actually, there are very many features of the system that are the same. So, the long-term investment into foresight work, beyond just individual projects, to actually processes, that are integrated with public policy, to institutions that continue to both nurture talent as well as to, I'm going to say, produce, foresight reports, foresight output. The fact that they have both very strong capabilities, both within the public sector as well as a wider ecosystem in the universities and private sector, that's also emerging. And to think about it as quite a strongly networked model. So you do see teams in various ministries, different government agencies. Generally, they're small and understaffed. Which forces you to find a friend, right? People tend to know each other well because they have to kind of work together, right? They have no choice, And I think for us, we've also benefited very much from the global community of foresight, and practitioners there. So maybe just a quick point just to close. I think another great example is just thinking about, again, the differences, right? So if I contrast another example, the Philippines, we also do have some Filipino colleagues here. So Singapore is a bit of a top-down model. The government is very enthusiastic, I would say. So, they have a very strong Prime Minister's Office Centre and so on. But the Philippines has grown in their foresight work quite significantly over the last few years. And in true Filipino fashion, it's people power, right? Like they've gone to this like futures literacy, kind of, the few times I've spoken at a webinar, it's hundreds of people at one shot, and that's because that's their context. And that's what works for them. So I think just to close, it's really understanding your unit of analysis, the operating environment that you are trying to change, and then pulling that global foresight, kind of insight, down to getting pretty specific and pretty contextual. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, especially because you gave us two different ways, two different strategies.
Yeah.
I must say that for the Greek government, we have discussed it. I presented your model because I like how you present to the public everything that you produce and then it's make it available.
Yes.
But we didn't go that direction. Anyway, I will change the order now. I will go back to you, Dimitri. And because we, as you said, usually we don't have enough expertise, we don't have enough people, we don't have enough resources. So a lot of experts know that public administrations are not yet fully ready to embrace the new technological evolution. So it's not only the resources, but maybe it's knowledge, maybe there are other things. So how do you see and how can this impact strategic foresight?
Thank you. This is another important point. I think the analysis is a little bit more nuanced in the sense that we see some good examples in terms of adopting new technologies in public administrations, but it's also very clear that the path towards fully embracing the new technological revolution is still quite long. I want to start with a positive example. We are, for instance, doing this horizon scanning exercise inside the European Commission. How does it work? We have experts from 9 EU institutions coming together and performing a news and data mining exercise empowered by artificial intelligence and new technologies. And then these signs of change resulting from this news and mining exercise are validated by experts, human experts, in a context of sense-making sessions, and these are then presented by Executive Vice President Maros Šefčovič to the College of Commissioners every 3 months in order to warn the policymakers about these new trends that might be eventually relevant for policymaking. At the same time, so this is the positive example, at the same time, it's clear that coming from the EU, I realize that we should do much better use, much further use of artificial intelligence, digital twins, for instance, in modeling, forecasting, in impact assessments that underlie major EU policies. And of course, that in order to do this, there are major challenges. For instance, we need a cultural revolution. There is a lot of inertia. There is a fear of automation among public employees. And of course, there is a big reskilling problem. We have some figures, we said that 1 out of 4 people lack basic digital skills. I think the figures are actually much worse as regards advanced digital skills, which is what we need right now. So indeed, path is still long. Now, your second question, is this relevant for strategic foresight? Yes, it is extremely relevant because, at least to me, I believe, it's clear that in the future, good anticipatory governance and good strategic foresight is likely to rely more and more on the capacity to store, extract, process, and analyze large amounts of information. So this means that strategic foresight leadership for public administrations is likely to have to go hand in hand more and more with a strategic approach to developing, deploying, and ensuring the uptake of industrial Internet of Things systems, 6G, and edge computing able to manage and analyze big data very, very quickly. I think that actually for the European Union, this is even more challenging because we have also our Green Deal goals by 2050, and we realize that this green transition by 2050, this climate neutrality by 2050, cannot be achieved with technology that exists today. So what exists today can take us maybe to 2030, if we're really good at that, but to achieve 2040 or 2050, we need things that today are only at the demonstration or prototype phase or don't exist at all. So I have people coming to my office and presenting all these amazing technologies to me, new types of fusion, new digital technologies. So indeed, we've published a Foresight report about the twinning of the green and digital transition. So it's very clear that this adoption is complex, but I believe there is no way back. Thank you.
Okay, so we need to find a way to introduce all this kind of thinking and planning. Amazing. Now changing the order again, I'm going back to Arti. So preparing for this moderation, I checked one of your recent TED Talks, and I noted, and I will read it as you said it, Good intentions alone cannot prevent harm, and good intentions alone can cause harm. And it is really nice, very strong statement. So how can ethical considerations be embedded into anticipatory governance practices? And what mechanisms shall be in place to ensure accountability and transparency in anticipatory governance?
Okay, thank you. So I know we're talking a lot about anticipatory governance, but we haven't actually defined it. And there isn't one standing definition that everybody is signed up to. It's an evolving space. In the space I work in, it's really about how do we make the types of decisions we need to make in order to be prepared for what is coming, to be able to pivot or to make the right types of investment choices to mitigate against what might be a future risk. So for me, when we're talking about governance, it's fundamentally the decision making that our policymakers and senior decision makers need to have to be able to understand where to best make investment choices. However, and I know we've also talked, there's a lot of the conversation today that's just focused on strategic foresight. Now this is my position is, and I come from working within large bureaucratic institutions and governments, is that foresight is not a silver bullet. It is a set of tools and approaches and mindsets that are aimed at helping people understand what to trade off in terms of whether they're prioritizing the today or tomorrow, to understand how to make a decision on something that they don't yet have the full amount of information on, because everything about the future is a perception of opportunity or a perception of risk, and how to ensure we understand the implications on our underlying value proposition. So, all of this will only ever privilege a certain group of people. And very often, and particularly when we talk about technology and we think of that in one silo, we often think about, well, who is this? This is definitely going to bring lots of benefits. Of course it is. But actually, there's a lot of harm that can come from it if it is not governed properly. So when we're understanding ethics and harm minimization, the value of being long-term in your thinking, of being anticipatory in your thinking, is understanding who might get left out of the benefits of this particular policy choice or investment choice. If we make this decision today to prioritize X, how might Y get impacted down the line? And those trade-offs, that analysis is not made usually, because we often think about the investment and policy and governance choices we make in terms, I think we make an assumption that everything is going to be all right. And whatever happens down the line, the downstream accountability, we don't really consider it, because we often think about risk through an institutional liability sense of what our legal liability means. That's not good enough. What we've seen happen over the last few years is how systems and structures of injustice, of inequity, that are designed to only privilege a certain few harms large swaths of the population. And when large swaths of the population are continuously harmed, it comes back to bite us. My hypothesis of crisis anticipation is that there are three pillars, right, of things that we need, levers we need to look out for. The first is how financially resilient is the particular state or institution to withstand whatever is coming their way. The second is, what is the level of transparency in how the governance structures are making their decision? How accountable are they? And who are they accountable to? Is it the immediate governing structure or to citizens that are going to live 10 years or 20 years from now? Policy making that's done today privileges today. And yet it is our children and grandchildren that will live with the result of the decisions we make today. And the third is, what is the level of trust between citizens and their decision makers and policy makers? Now, if you sort of group these three levers together, if one falls, and I'm talking about this from a nation-state perspective, your state can probably still be resilient. But if two or more fall, which we have seen happen just in the last 3 years alone to multiple countries, whether it's global north or global south, it collapses. So, why thinking and embedding ethics and harm minimization is as important, not just in the present day, but also in the longer term, is it de-risks the proposition. it de-risks the value of investment that we're making, because what we have to argue for, which is our moral obligation to do for those of us that work in anticipation, is to understand that all of this is only going to matter if our decision makers feel resilient and strong enough to make a risky decision based on something they don't know what the answer is to. So yeah, thinking we've got all the answers and we're making the policy decisions today based on an echo chamber worldview might seem good, and it might have good intentions, but our good intentions can also cause incredible harm down the line, as we have seen happen over and over and over again in our history.
Perfect. Thank you. And I really like that you added this kind of long-termism thinking on that it should be important in policy making and how we take decisions. So I'm going to you now, but you two, don't relax just yet, because I have one final question at the end after we take the questions from the audience, because I see Dimitri that is already relaxing over here. Okay? All right. So Cheryl, I have a question for you. I mean, we are Foresight practitioners.
Yeah.
I mean, part of our work is to experiment, is to be creative, to test new things, new tools. We really love it. This is part of our business. But what role do experimentation and prototyping play in anticipatory governance? And how can the impact of policies be measured effectively? This is another thing.
Yeah. Great, thanks. Maybe one distinction to invite you guys to make is to think about the production of foresight as being separate from the usage or consumption of foresight, right? And especially when you think of a bureaucratic system, you know, and we are in a gathering of futures, so a lot of us spend a lot of time producing foresight. But, you know, very often when I manage teams, one of the things I say is that, you know, don't write the report for the drawer, right? You know, it's actually for your boss, for your minister, for your permanent secretary, etc. You know, so at some point there is a handoff, you know, that kind of needs to happen, you know, and experimentation and prototyping for the real world, right? And if you don't do that handoff properly, there's a bit of a valley of death, right? Where, you know, it kind of doesn't go anywhere, and it's like quite frustrating. So I would say it's really thinking through, you know, what's the absorptive capacity of our organizations and how to build that up. You know, can we actually absorb in our organizations good foresight work? You know, and what does that mean by, you know, absorb, right? So again, maybe just to give a quick example about what I mean. You know, so when we, and again, it's a challenge to our own field, right? So 2 weeks ago, I was in with a Global Design Futures Network event. So it's a collaboration between Tsinghua, Carnegie Mellon, and Politico di Milano. And so it's a lot of thinking through, right, how to integrate the design field and the foresight field. And there is one school of thought where, of course, design contributes to the communication of foresight, right? You know, this is the experiential futures kind of work that's also really important. And so one conversation they were having is that actually, how do we use design tools to pull, you know, the foresight really into the real world, right? Because very often, actually, we are designing for a future that we do not want, or it's not sustainable, you know. So how do we pull that across a lot more, you know? And you know, this testing, you know, and prototyping, I think that would be my encouragement, right? To like see how that closes the gap. My last government job in the Singapore government was the Ministry of Transport. So when I was there, I was overseeing the autonomous vehicle portfolio. And it was quite easy to jump up and down and tell my bosses about like autonomy. You know, this is almost 10 years ago, so it was quite some time. You know, these are the trends you need to be looking at, and so on. But to be honest, a lot of the breakthrough really happened when we started to zone places for testing, right? And it was I would say, a humble kind of conversation between both industry as well as government to say, you know, the reality is we don't know. You know, but what we can do is set up regulatory kind of safe spaces, you know, sandboxes to learn together and be in a constant process of conversation. And I think that this is where the futures work is quite helpful as a platform, because nobody has a expertise in that sense on the future, right? We are just trying to understand it better together. Then your second question around impact and evaluation. So as you mentioned, you know, I spent some time heading a consulting firm that does policy program evaluation. So allow me to switch hats to the evaluator hat. And again, to be self-critical about the field, right? In many cases, and there's a huge demand for more and more evaluation within the policy space, and definitely that is true. Definitely that you see that in Foresight as well, and we talk about the impact a lot. But there is a almost definitional challenge, when you're trying to figure out the impact of a future thing that, I just looked at Cambodia scenarios for 2050. Do I have to wait until 2051 before I can evaluate? I mean, it's a fundamental challenge, right? But then does that mean that I throw my hands in the air and say, therefore, because it's 2051, I don't do anything? That's also not a viable kind of response. So I think, for me, I think about it more from the perspective of how do we close the implementation and impact gap. There are a lot of things we already know works. It's like, I know I need to eat my vegetables and go to the gym, right? I don't need to wait until, to evaluate whether or not I'm doing it. Just go and do it, So, I mean, that's, I think, the thing that I would love to encourage, right, in the policy space. That there's so many things we know work. Let's design that from the beginning, and how do we think about it from, so in evaluation, we talk about being clear about your theory of change, right? Thinking through your input, your process, your output measures as well as your outcome impact measures, and having that much more holistic, I would say, view to what, kind of long-term impact for Foresight means. I will close my remarks with a somewhat humorous stories. So in one of my many futures roles, I won't mention which one, I had a performance review, right? This is the boring nuts and bolts thing of doing this kind of work, right? So I go to see my boss and I said, hello, I think I did quite well for the year, right? I worked very hard, And then, so my point to my boss at the time was, I said, for every hour that I spend producing Foresight research, I think you need to give me another hour to do communication and engagement, right? And if that's the case, then the real implications is that I will do half the number of projects that Arti and Dimitri do, and you need to see that not as I am unproductive, right? But that I am actually, if you can choose the right projects, do it properly, close that gap, design it well, then you're in a much better position to get impact. Yeah, I won't tell you how that performance appraisal conversation went.
Okay.
But just to make that point, yeah,
Perfect,
thanks.
Perfect. Thank you. I mean, that I would like to hear more about the story, but I mean, we have a full house. Let's try to give the floor to take some questions from the audience, and I see they're already, wow, okay. Okay, let's start from the back.
Hi, Josh Polcher. I work at the OECD, bringing strategic foresight to how governments anticipate and manage emerging critical risk. Cheryl talked about the impact gap. I'd like to ask you about the abstract trap and how, as futurists, we tend to find ourselves in this valley of, well, the future's kind of out there and not really sure about it. How do we make things concrete so that policymakers, decision makers can really grasp this without it being too scary that they then drop it because it's too hot?
No, thank you, Josh. I mean, this is actually the front and center of what I do inside the Commission, trying to make it concrete and operational. This is what my Executive Vice President asked me to do since day one, because indeed this is the problem. And I started actually with this in my first reply. We don't want just to do like scientific research for the sake of it, but we want to influence policy making. The first thing that we did concretely was to make sure, for instance, that in our strategic foresight report, there is this big foresight exercise, 200 pages, run by the experts in full scientific independence. We start from this, but then we summarize it, or we start from in order to produce a 15, 20 pages doc max that includes some concrete recommendations, because people have limited time and need to be able to absorb the concrete implications of it. Second, how to make it concrete. I think I would like to connect to what Cheryl and Arti actually mentioned. It's very important that strategic foresight is part of the policy design process, and the way in which we are trying to do it, I'm not saying that it's over, but first steps, is to integrate it into better regulation. So now strategic foresight is part of the evaluation of every major piece of legislation inside the European Union, but ideally, in the future, even impact assessments should be done via new technologies, focus on strategic foresight in order, for instance, to understand the impact of legislation onto next generations, in order to understand who is most affected and left behind by each piece of legislation. So this is how you make it concrete, how you make it operational, how you make it matter. And that's when suddenly the future becomes something that people want to listen to, and overcoming this fear of pessimism, fear of inaction, we move to what I called foresight optimism.
First of all, I would like to thank the experience you shared. I think most of the time that you influence the policy and telling this is what should be done to the government to release us to preferable futures. Is there any incidents that at all, or share your experience that the government try to please the next voter? You don't see a long haul, and you know by heart that that's going to lead to the undesirable futures. What would you do about that?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think it's a very practical one. I think the first thing to say is that actually when we're, there's this question of like, how much is it my job to be like, this is the future. I think it's, this is the future. I think it's going to happen, stand on my soapbox and kind of preach to whoever's going to listen to me. I used to describe my future's role in government as a future advocate, right? That, just as there are, for example, children don't get a right to vote, right? Environment doesn't get a right to vote. The future also doesn't really get a right to vote, right? So what's that way of kind of advocating for that? What I would say is that also to think about the different kind of functions of futures work. So some of it is that visioning, kind of coming together with a common vision. Some of it is also strategic alignment, like what I was sharing in the Finnish case, to be able to come together on a same platform, to move in the same direction, however slowly, is not trivial. Some of it is actually just to question the fundamental assumptions about the way that we look at the present, right? So just to go back to Joshua's point earlier, right? It's also thinking around what are the practical things we can do. So again, is it about me creating the best set of scenarios? Or is it about, let's say, borrowing a set of OECD scenarios and saying, hey, can I critically evaluate this? And can I stress test, red team, this set of scenarios to look at my existing policy and say, actually, there are one or two blind spots, that I need to address. If I can address these, my decisions for the future would already be better. So just a quick response. Thanks.
Thank you for this kind information. My question about the meta trend. Like we can spend as a government, invest too much, but still there is huge or big mega trend it's happen. We cannot handle that. So how we can make the balance or make something you can't handle that.
So can I just repeat that question to make sure I understood it properly? If you see it's a question about how do you handle a mega trend that you feel is outside your scope of influence.
Yes.
Right. Okay. So, and this is going to link to your question as well, and also Joshua's question. The tool isn't as you're not producing. The most important part of this process of thinking long term, of being anticipatory, is understanding the implications of what that means on your bottom line. Right? So even if you think this trend, it's too big for us to handle, I don't know what it seems too abstract, or it's only considering one group of people, doing an impact analysis on what it's going to mean for your institution or your business or whatever, your bottom line. How is it going to impact your reputational issues? How is it going to impact your product design, your service design? Is it actually going to be a risk if you don't do something about it versus what you're doing about it, right? And then what must you trade off if you decide to make a policy decision on something that may or may not happen? It is a trade-off. What must you trade off around that? But the most important thing in all of this is getting our decision makers to understand that there will be an impact and implication of this. And often in foresight work, we produce a set of scenarios or the trends report or etc. What we don't do enough of is that implications analysis. What could this mean for our bottom line? What could this mean for our constituents? What does it look like? Are we resilient enough to handle it? What would happen if we don't invest into this now? The decision could still be, well, it's too big for us to handle. Okay, it may be too big for us to handle in the next 2 years. We don't have enough of a financial budget or an envelope. but perhaps we can put aside, as what Dimitri and Cheryl was saying, a small bit of investment to either understand it a little bit more or innovate against it so that when it does happen, because it inevitably will happen, we are better prepared. So I guess in summary, I would say, understanding what will prompt our decision makers to make a different type of decision is an essential part of being long-term and anticipatory. Most of my work is influence. Most of my work in policy design is influence.
Okay, one final question. You have 30 seconds, not 30 minutes each of one. I mean, the museum here, it is focusing on year 2071. How you imagine governance in year 2071? Do you think AI is going to have a role on this? Half a minute each of you.
Of course, I imagine, if I imagine year 2071, I imagine a more agile, future-proof, anticipatory governance, and of course, I imagine artificial intelligence with a big role in it, actually, hopefully, even well before 2071, maybe 2051, and even before, for instance, to ensure more participation of citizens into policymaking, and it comes to my mind because we have already pioneered AI to this goal in the context of the Conference on the Future of Europe in a very simple way. So artificial intelligence-powered digital platform to have a seamless conversation among everybody who wanted to have it on important themes. In the future, we could and should do much more, including what my colleagues have correctly mentioned until now, impact of policy design. Thank you.
Arti.
Governance since 2071.
Yeah.
I actually would say, and it's probably an unpopular opinion, is governance is going to look very, very different in the sense that it's not just about AI or technology, but that our landscape would have shifted so significantly. Our geopolitical alliances are already shifting so significantly. There will be people that have lesser borders or more fluid borders. We're not going to look like what we look like today. So governance in 2071, what I hope for is a governance system that looks at the impact of policies on all people, regardless of where they are, rather than just on a small group of people, because that's what's going to enable us to thrive.
Thank you. Thank you. Cheryl, your views?
A good futurist never predicts, is the joke. No, but I think the way to think about it is to say that there is one part of it, which is a conversation about what does government and the business of government look like in 2071. But the second part is to think about what does governance look like in terms of the way that we make decisions, and specifically whether we're going to be able to make better decisions for the future. Maybe as just one small point, because I talked about prototyping, evaluation, and so on, it's also to look at what the other fields around us are, how they're evolving. So I'm an economist by training. There was one season of economics, kind of work and research, which was very theory focused. Then there was another season which became very empirically focused, right? Looking at data, big data, and analyzing that. And we're now kind of moving into an experimentation phase. So I think if a good futurist, if you look at the way that those trends are going, the kinds of tools that are going to be able to allow us to experiment and evaluate the experiment will be drastically different from the tools that are available to us today. So I do hope that there will be more room for that in the future as well.
Perfect. Thank you. A big applause to all of you. A big applause to you.